Just
minor technical difficulty. One moment, please, customers.
nearly there.
Buffering.
Recording in progress.
Councillor Daly will be late, and we have apologies from Councillors Joyce, Coxhead and Granger, who are unable to be here. So with that, we'll move into the hearings, and first up we have Jessie Brennan and Rick Powdell from Federated Farmers. So over to you.
Thank you. Again, I'm going to sound like a bit of a broken record, but thank you very much for having us to speak to our submission around the fees and charges. Yeah, our submission on this was relatively brief, and for those that are sort of part of the discussion on the livestock movements bylaw, a lot of that does relate to, I guess, a bit of overlap there about what we're trying to seek here. So our submission really focused on the fees and charges around the livestock bylaws movement and how much the permit costs and increases have gone up for the upcoming financial year. Once again, we had a point there around, I guess, consistency of the wording used, and our preference would be around the use of the word permit as opposed to a consent in relation to those. We also have talked about this potential pathway for an infrequent stock movement. So in our mind, this would be up to 3 times a year to account for a movement where a farmer might purchase cattle or stock off a neighbouring property and need to move them down the road, but might potentially trip the need or for a permit under the bylaw. So yeah, we think that's a really integral part of sort of what we're talking about here in terms of fees and charges and how we could provide a pathway for farmers for that. And something that we didn't talk about, which I'm sorry, it might get a little touch on the hand here, but just taking into account those high volume roads and things, it could be about the timing of those movements, you know, avoiding school times, peak commuting hours, all those sorts of things as well. So yeah, and we also had a point there around, which felt like there wasn't really very good justification in the consultation material around why the fee structures for the permits has changed, which ties into our points, I guess, around is there a problem that we're trying to address here, or where has this come from in terms of that large increase, bearing in mind there's no renewal fee on that, but curious to know a bit more about that. So I'll leave it there unless Rick has something else he'd like to add, and then we'll open up for questions.
Thanks, Jessie. Rick, did you want to say anything?
I won't at this stage.
Okay, thank you. Councillors, questions? Must have answered them all. Councillor Murray-Benge.
Your concern about the increase in charges, you found that there was no justification for them, and to the increase that they were, what would you have expected any increase to actually be?
Yeah, so if I remember correctly off the top of my head, the consultation materials said that the costs had been changed to align with vehicle crossings, and it was just sort of a one-liner in the consultation material about that without sort of any further justification or information in there. So we don't particularly have an increase in mind, if that's the right word to say. I guess we're looking for anything that farmers are always, I guess, trying to save money where they can, and we appreciate there's things like inflation and that sort of thing, which does mean that costs do increase sometimes, but yeah, we certainly didn't have something in mind, but it's more about why has this actually changed and why is the structure changed from that 5-year permit and getting a renewal versus a larger cost up front for a new permit and then no renewal fee from that point. Rick, not sure if you had anything to add on that.
The only thing I would say is, it's like a lot of things. If you ask people to pay a cost and they think it's exorbitant, well, then they may well decide to dodge it and take a risk. If they see it's fair and justifiable, well, then they'll probably go down the road of complying. And I think, too often we see bad practice being forced by exorbitant costs of compliance. And I suppose that's all I'd say. And I think, to go from 166 to 866 seems exorbitant to me. And if I was, if you put a farmer's hat on and he was thinking about moving some stock a couple of k's down the road in a one-off movement, I would say a lot of them would go, well, hang on a minute. But for $166, they'd go, well, the truck's going to cost me X to come in here, $166. That's, that's sensible. And you get a complying movement.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Sol.
Thank you, sir. It crosses over a little bit here because I guess one interrelates a little bit with the former session we had, sir. But the costs, I presume, from where we're sitting, okay, come from a lot of our costs and admin and so on, and we're having to, I guess, try and cover costs. But I take on board what you're saying about, hey, if you make things difficult and things kept simple is really the way to go about it. But I'm not sure, I guess, and this is really an operational issue, so I'm not sure where our staff sit with this, but there would or could be potential costs in us allowing a permit. How do we and how do you relate to the NATE requirements to move stock, and how do we cover ourselves if something happens with stock going down the road?
Well, if you, the NATE laws are quite clear for farmers. So I think that one sort of looks after itself. And I think, just when we're talking about stock, farmers who are moving stock, their stock is their livelihood, their income. And while at the same time they are hopefully looking after the general public while they're moving stock across roads or down roads, they also have in mind they're looking after stock. And, if I use my own example, I move stock on the road. Admittedly, we live on a very low volume road, but we always have a person in front and a person in the back, so that, we're warning people coming up behind or going in front. Because, if we don't have anyone in front, someone comes steaming around the corner, we've suddenly got a real mess of a whole lot of dead livestock and a motorist who could have issues also. So, we need to remember that 99.9% of farmers are out there looking after the stock and the general public.
So you don't see any extra charges or time or work required by our staff to be, obviously somebody still pays for it. You don't see that being an issue with allowing a permit for simple, low frequency movements.
Yeah, I'm not working at council, so I can't really speak to, I guess, how time consuming or intensive these processes are for your staff. I guess what we're trying to say here is that we sort of envision that if you've got a permit needed for movements or droving that is quite frequent, and that's why you need a permit to begin with, that would require potentially a bit more review when that permit application comes in terms of checking, where the sign's going to be, all that sort of thing, compared to, say, an infrequent movement that's probably a little bit more straightforward around, it's a one-off, we're moving between A to B or wherever that might be. Yeah, so we do see it's about that proportionate to risk, yes, but it's also that proportionate cost to what the risk of that activity actually is as well. And we sort of understand that off the top of my head as well, the fees and charges has a separate sort of charging mechanism in terms of compliance assessment, or if there's an issue identified with a stock movement or permit as well. So I guess there's sort of that upfront administration sort of task by staff, for lack of a better word, and then there's sort of a different issue if there's actually an issue identified with that crossing or that permit as well, which comes from a different funding mechanism.
And I'd just add, for a a permanent stock crossing that's used frequently, there may be I'd imagine that someone would probably at some stage view it. But in the case of someone who rings up wanting to move stock a short distance down a road, that's a completely different thing and should be able to be done over the phone, or at least by a couple of quick emails, which wouldn't be a high cost. And I'd just add also that we have our staff for some information around how this fee's been set, which we haven't received yet, so we can't comment on it.
Could I just ask a supplementary question, perhaps in relation to Councillor Sol there? So would you be comfortable with something similar to what happens with a lot of fire permits? That there's a phone call made and often the permit's issued without any, quite in a few hours, without having to come and visit or anything like that in many cases.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Particularly in the case of, infrequent movements. And I think, the point that Jesse made that we should have made in the earlier submission was the timing of movement often is the big thing. It's, if I take my own case, we never move stock on the road in a half-hour period either side of when the school buses come. And that takes out, that means we're not interfering with the school buses, the few teachers that go up the road, and the various people who are going to work. So, I mean, in that process, often, I might ring up on a permit and the answer might be, yes, you've got a permit, but it's between 10 and 2. So that the identified time is when the road is going to be at the lowest volume of traffic. Minimise disruption for everybody.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Wickers.
Yeah, just a quick thought. Do you see the distance travelled is part of the overall assessment of that? So you've been referring to moving between farms. Is that really what you're talking about? Just less than a kilometre type scenario?
I would definitely say so, because then you get into the question of whether you're actually droving the stock some distance, which is a whole different ball game.
Councillor Murray-Benge.
I lost what you were saying there, Mr. Powdrill, about the distance or the timing. Are you saying that if council determines that you can shift your cows between, or cattle between 10 and 2, that takes away your ability to work around what's happening locally? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I was saying was that through the permitting process, council, because they've got fairly good information about usage of their roads and what traffic volumes are and when, they may say, yes, we'll grant you a permit, but it has to be between this time, because council knows at that time that'll be the minimum traffic volume during a day.
Are you saying that farmers aren't wise enough to figure it out for themselves as to when's the best time to shift their cattle?
Most probably are.
Okay, I think we've exhausted the questions, so thank you very much for coming in. Appreciate your input.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Cheers.
Thank you.
All right, so next up we have Matthew Kerr there. If if you'd like to come forward, please. Yep, that's fine. All right, so when you're ready, you've just touched the right-hand button.
There we go.
Yep, that's the one.
Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Mayor and elected members and staff for having me here today to present on our submission. First up, I just want to give apologies from Carl Salmons, who's our director. He wasn't able to make it today, but I'll be speaking on his behalf. My name's Matthew Kerridge. I'm the team leader for planning at Maven Bay of Plenty. Just a little bit about us, as to who we are. For those who don't know, Maven Bay of Plenty are a locally owned and operated land development consultancy, essentially. We have surveyors, civil engineers, planners like myself. We're part of the wider Maven Group, who have over 170 land development specialists across the country. Maven Bay of Plenty, we work quite closely with a number of key land developers in the Western Bay, and in recent years have been involved in some reasonably significant land development projects within the district, including Harbour Ridge, which is an ongoing project, quite significant in Omokaroa. And really what it does is put us in quite a good spot to understand the land development process right from initial concept development through to the delivery of homes and land. So our submission is looking at both the financial contributions, FINCOs, and fees and charges. From our perspective, they're working with clients who are currently looking to release land, looking to enable housing, which is a much needed issue at the moment. So in terms of the financial contributions, I think it's first up really important to set out the current economic climate, where we have property sales, which are stagnating at the moment. We have land values, which are static or in some cases reducing. We've got higher interest rates, although they are coming down, but there's still a reasonable degree of economic uncertainty, particularly when you look at a broader global economic perspective. All of this has really contributed to the last 18 months, which has been, over the last decade at least, the most significant downturn in land development across the country, but particularly here in the Western Bay of Plenty. We still have all the ingredients which are resulting in high housing demand. I know it's not translating into sales right now, but we still have, 2023 was record migration rates. While they have come down in the most recent statistical year, they're still very high, and we are expecting that will continue in the future. We do have forecasts for interest rates to continue to drop down, and as they drop, we expect to see an increase in the property market again. And as widely talked about in the media, the Western Bay is the least affordable rental market in the country. So that need for housing is still very much there, despite the fact that market conditions, at face value, don't seem to be saying so. And this really leads into the big issue that we have at the moment, which is money is really hard to come by, and it's hard to come by for the council. It's equally as hard to come by for developers at the moment, who are really having to look into detail at what the financial viability is for all of the projects that we're currently working with. We continue to see increases to FINCOs over the last for years on end now. While some of them aren't increasing so much this year, we still have some significant increases in some of the key areas, such as Omokaroa and Katikati. And this is at a point where a lot of these projects are right on the cusp of whether, you know, a developer deciding whether to hit the go button or not because of the financial viability. We're in talks with a number of developers at the moment where, particularly in Omokoroa, looking at whether they hold on to land that's essentially bank land and wait for market conditions to increase, or look to continue to develop. We have clients that have land that's ready to go, but right now the market conditions are such that it's really difficult to create the titles. You know, we have infrastructure and ground, subdivision consents all granted, ready to go. We just need to pay the FINCOs. But when you have a market that's really difficult to sell, you know, you're better off to just hold on to that land for a few years until things pick up, particularly if you're getting hit with big charges and you may not be able to sell that piece of land for a number of years. And so this is where we really see some issue with increasing FINCOs, particularly in Omokoroa, and would urge council to consider some of the alternatives which might be at hand to try and smooth out the burden, really, particularly that immediate burden, understanding that there is a need for infrastructure to support this growth, but imminently, we're seeing some quite significant change coming from central government in terms of how some of these projects will be funded. Talking about, obviously, it's too early to say whether the Western Bay will be included in this, but we have the regional deals, which we should know have a fair steer. Maybe you as elected members have more idea than we do about what our chances are there, but all the whisperings are that we're near, if not top of the list there. And that, from everything we've heard, is going to be a game changer. We also obviously have complete overhaul of the system that's coming through in terms of financial contributions, development contributions, and some alternative mechanisms for smoothing over those costs, which will hopefully result in a more equitable and sustainable outcome. Could also look to defer projects. I think right now is if there's any time to pump the brakes in terms of some of these projects that are forecast longer term, this year is probably the year, just on the basis that we know things are going to change, and it could do quite a lot to help to release land and have that ready for people to start moving in and building houses when we know that there's another boom most likely just around the corner. So I'll quickly jump on to some of the fees and charges issues that we've got in our submission. So I just want to touch on the Auditor General has a practice code for setting fees and cost recovery there. And there's 4 principles, which are equity, efficiency, justifiability, and transparency. And we've seen that some of these principles, we don't feel that they're being applied quite as effectively as they could be. I think a key one there would be, I'm a planner. I work with the resource consents team a lot. Unlike a lot of other councils, we don't have upfront costs for what the charge out rates are. We don't know. It's a little bit of a lottery in terms of what you're going to get. Tauranga City Council, while their rates may be very, very high in terms of their charge out rates, they at least have them open upfront. You know, at the start of a project when you're allocated a planner what their charge out rate's going to be, and you can start to plan accordingly in terms financially, in terms of what you expect the processing costs are going to be. I think it would be really important in terms of transparency to have those sort of similar rates. And I know that they do have those rates in the fees and charges for the building consent team, for instance, and it's unclear why there's a reluctance to release something similar for the resource consents team. On the matter of rates, of the charge out rates for council staff, an ongoing issue has been that the hourly rates have increased substantially, particularly over the last sort of 4 to 5 years. Acknowledge that there have been quite substantial increases in staff costs and overhead. But when you compare that to the private sector and the charge out rates that the private sector are offering up for the same services, we're now quite regularly finding that council staff rates are considerably higher, which begs the question, what are these overheads covering? Where in the private sector, obviously there's a degree here of my overhead, of all of my consultancy buddies overhead, which is profit. Council doesn't have that. I would hazard a guess that maybe there's a little bit of a slip in terms of how some of these charge out rates are being calculated. I know I have worked in council previously, and the systems are definitely much more lax than they would be in a consultancy setting, where we have calculations that are quite clear in terms of building in all of our overheads, our expected profits, to come up with a charge out rate which is, you know, competitive, really. So I'd really urge council to maybe start to dig a little deeper into why these rates are set as they are. And I know that council staff often have multiple roles within the organisation. Some of them are directly to services to, you know, user pay services such as resource consent processing, building consent processing. But most of these staff also have other overheads which are more general advice to the wider public and to staff members, which in theory shouldn't be charged to a user pays at a user pays system. Finally, just wanted to touch on a couple of the specific charges for particular applications. I suppose at first, just want to talk about the idea of having a minimum set fee for a number of the applications. When they're really low fees, it's not such an issue. If it's clearly just to cover the basic administrative fees, I understand having a minimum set fee. But we're more and more seeing these minimum set fees for things that are much more variable in terms of their costs. So Section 127 applications is a variation to resource consents, is one which has now gone up to over $4,000. Some of these applications are very simple, where we'd expect maybe half a day to a day of work from council staff to process them. It might be just changing stamped plans and really just updating some numbering in an application. When we're given a over $4,000 minimum fee, that just seems completely out of whack with what the work is, really. And so we'd really push to have an alternative process where if there is a minimum fee, it should be set based on the minimum administrative charges, and then anything else can be charged out at a time cost basis. Just to summarize, really appreciate the opportunity to come in and speak today. I think that council has some really hard decisions to make at the moment, because it is a very difficult time. We obviously want to ensure that development continues, but also ensure that there's long-term integrity in terms of our infrastructure that's provided. And yeah, I don't envy your positions in terms of the decisions that need to be made today. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew. Any questions, councillors? Councillor Daly.
Matthew, in terms of the staff hourly charge out rates and the significant increases over the last 5 years, do you feel that you get, I was going to say value for money, but timely and efficient advice, delivery of advice when you do actually come and consult with the staff?
I think it can be quite variable. There are times where we appreciate what we're getting, but there's also plenty of times where we get our invoice at the end. We find out what the charge out rates are going to have been once we've got the invoice after the work's there. And sometimes we see stuff that are charged out at quite significant rates still taking a very long time to process what we think to be reasonably simple applications. So I would say that it's very much a variable outcome that we're getting there. And I would at least say that the charge out rates that are being charged aren't reflective of this level of service that we're receiving. Essentially, when we're getting charge out rates that would be effectively the same as a director in private consultancy, and you're getting maybe intermediate type level work coming back to us.
And also, I'm just not 100% sure. Do you actually process applications for developers, or you're a developer yourself?
So we prepare applications, we do the surveying work, the civil engineering. We do process applications for other councils, not Western Bay, but primarily we prepare the applications and consult on planning, surveying, engineering matters.
So you just pass on the charges to your client?
Yeah, that's right.
And you've had feedback from the client that they get?
We very regularly get pushback to essentially say, why is this so high? Can we do anything about it? And we can, there are mechanisms to push back, but when the charge out rate is incredibly high, it's hard to really push back on that because that's fixed in these sorts of processes, not at the point where you're actually getting charged.
And just one last question. On the minimum set fees, the resource consent variation with a minimum fee of $4,000. Are you sure that they can be actioned within like a few hours, as you say, or is there some background work that staff might have to go away and consider?
So, I guess the point there would be that they're quite variable. If it was the most common situation is where there are relatively minor changes to plans or wording and conditions, and the time that it takes can be less than a day. There are situations where they're much larger, but these are minimum fees. So the way that all of the resource consents and building consents, as far as I'm aware as well, are worked is that the minimum fees are set, and then anything over and above that is charged out. As opposed to there used to be a deposit process where you'd put in a deposit, and essentially if you didn't hit that deposit, you get a refund. So say we put in $4,000 and it only costs council $1,500 to process it, our client would get $2,500 back. But these are now minimum fees. So regardless of whether it takes 2 hours or 20 hours, well, if it's 20 hours, they're going to continue to charge over and above that 4,000. But if it's only 2, that 4,000 is still set. It's 4,000 plus. And that's where we have an issue because in recent years, we've also seen a real push towards getting these variations in the resource consent space rather than what's called in general accordance. So when you have plans that are stamped at the resource consent stage, they're typically relatively high level, and there are aspects that are going to potentially shift and move to some degree. And it used to be that, and a lot of councils still take this approach, that as long as the final plan comes back and the lines are generally where you expect them to be, even if things have shifted and moved a little bit, that would be in general accordance and there's no fee there. This is generally what we expected to see. Now we're getting pushback, saying, looking at minute details, saying, well, this fence has changed slightly. This wall is not as 100 mil out from where it used to be. We want new plans stamped, which is where we have the only process to do that is through Section 127 of the RMA.
Just finally,
yeah,
it could be quick because I've got a few other questions.
So you're suggesting that maybe there could be some subdivisions, even though our fees are quite comprehensive, some subdivisions within that particular one you're questioning?
Yeah, potentially. I think it would be it might be hard to try and divide that up. I think it might be simpler just to have a much lower minimum set fee, which is as I said, effectively an administrative fee, understanding that it's going to take X number of hours for any application to have a look at it, figure out what it's about and allocate that. And then from there, just like any other application, all fees beyond that would be just charged at an hourly rate. And hopefully we'd have an hourly rate that we have some transparency around and know what that's going to be.
Right, thank you for that. Councillor Murray Benge.
Thank you, sir, for coming in and giving us the benefit of your experience. We really appreciate the opportunity to question you and to understand what's happening out there in the community. My question is related to Omokoroa. You said that interest rates and everything and the money's hard to come by, and there was a risk of land banking out at Omokoroa. How does this council make sure that we actually stay competitive and encourage the development of housing? What are we doing wrong that we can change to make sure we can get that development going?
Thank you for that question. It's quite a complex answer, really, but simple in another sense. I mean, to be competitive, we need to keep prices down as much as we can. Obviously, the flip side to that is we also need to be able to deliver infrastructure to the community, and that's going to cost. That's going to have significant cost. I think there's an aspect in Omokoroa in particular of looking at this huge raft of infrastructure that's required, and the way that the FINCOs are currently structured essentially is that that's spread out across all the sites, all the greenfield sites anyway, in the peninsula, and regardless of how much benefit any particular landowner is getting from from that infrastructure, everyone's paying more or less the same. The reality is there's anything that's more or less along Omokoroa Road, the level of servicing or upgrades that are required is significantly less than if you're on the other side of the peninsula where it's been farms and orchards for even more. That area is going to require far more infrastructure that costs a lot more. It's also more likely to be developed much further down the line. So I think there could be a degree of trying to maybe work out if we can cut some of these this lower hanging fruit out of the broader FINCO pool, and there'll still need to be a degree of smoothing of spreading some of those costs. But particularly where we have developers that, as I said, have their own internal infrastructure in place, subdivisions consented and more or less ready to go. It's just a matter of actioning titles. What we're seeing at the moment is the cost of FINCOs constantly increasing without seeing any increase in land values has meant that they're just going to sit back. And so unless FINCOs are meeting land values, land just won't be released.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, Councillor Henry.
Section 4 says it all in terms of what you've come here today to really talk to us about. This is quite removed from what we do on day to day, but we do hear about it in the community. People come to talk to us about it. So thank you for coming in and giving your point of view of it. And I do agree, when I looked at the charge out rates, I thought exactly what you said. Is this really what the value of what our staff are working through at the moment on this consent? And I think the point that you've made in the cost efficiency, if you're being asked to pay more for something that you're receiving, you do deserve to have a better service.
Could you come to the question, please, Councillor?
Yes. So what I'm asking about all these things here is, and your point about the minimum fee for the S127, how would you see, can you explain to me, first of all, what you meant by ring fencing in the last point in section 4? How would that help? Ring fencing to improve processing time, staff levels process. I didn't understand what that meant. In point 4, the last point, ring fence to improve processing times of staffing level of processing.
Just give me 1 second. I'll just find our own
It's
submission.
about public transparency in point 4.3.
I think that yeah. 4.3. I understand.
So we shall read it out to you.
Yeah. In terms of
We
ring
also
fence-
request the additional revenue as ring fence to improve processing times, staffing levels and digital systems in the consenting process.
I see where my issue is. we've actually got two 4.3s in the submission, so I was
Oh,
reading
yeah,
one above
sorry.
it.
Oh, it's on,
That should
it's on
actually be
it's on the
4.6.
next page.
Yep.
You might have gone down to.
Yeah, I suppose that's really looking at if there's going to be such significant charge out rates, we'd be expecting that staff are going to be very competent in terms of what they're doing. And so it would be looking at potentially ring fencing things like, as it says in here, staff training, ensuring that who we're dealing with are incredibly competent in what they're doing, rather than I'd have to, the invoices that we receive from council aren't necessarily in such a level of detail where it's telling you exactly what's going on in each situation, but there's definitely an element of training which is going on regularly within applications. We wouldn't expect to see that if you're having higher level staff, or at least conversely, if there's going to be such high charge out rates, there should be maybe internal training or out to external trainers, or potentially just using external consultants that are already trained in what's going on, rather than being, having to pay for something that the developer's not really benefiting from, I suppose, if that sort of makes sense. I think that's really where we're going there.
And going back to the point that you made about the 4,225 for the S127 applications, how would you see transparency around that? Because as you said, some will be more detailed and complex and others will be very simple. But it appears from how you've written there that you've read it, that it's a one fee for every minimum variation that you have.
Yeah, I mean, it's stated as a minimum fee in the the proposed fees and charges. So the way, I think there's a little sub note in there that says this is the minimum fee, anything additional will be charged. And from our experience with these minimum fees, you don't get a refund if it's less than that. So as I stated earlier, I think the best way would be to have a low level minimum fee and then everything else charged at transparent rates.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Our last question's been withdrawn, so thank you, Matthew. Appreciate you coming and giving us the time and your explanations. You've given us all a bit to think about there. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
So next up we have Aaron Collier. So if you'd like to come forward, please, Aaron.
Good afternoon, councillors, council staff. I'd like to introduce to you Andre from Classic Group. He is the General Manager of Classic Developments Limited. He is here to answer any questions in relation to specifically the Classic Group developments at Omokoroa. So perhaps if you've got questions of Mr. De Jong at the very end, we can perhaps respond to those kind of jointly. But I appear today on behalf of a number of submitters, including McLaughlin Drive Limited, who are developing 363 lots at McLaughlin Drive in Te Puke. Brian Goldstone, with respect to his land at Omokoroa, Brian's looking at 140 lots at Prole Road, and of course, Classic Group, which Mr. De Jong is representing, and Classic have a number of subdivisions at Omokoroa. Apologies also from the Urban Task Force have asked me to speak on their behalf as well. Unfortunately, Mr. Adams is overseas, and also Mr. Goldstone's actually in the South Island, so they're unable to attend today. But I suppose cutting straight to the chase, the common issue that's been raised in all of the submissions is the level of financial contribution increases for urban areas, particularly in terms of Te Puke and Omokoroa. These changes that are proposed are what I would describe as being significant. They're effectively 11% in both of those urban growth areas. So, for example, in Te Puke, that's going to increase from $48,790 to $54,000 plus GST. And Omokoroa is increasing from $79,000 to
$100,000. And when you add GST on top of that for a Makaroa, that's over $100,000 in terms of a financial contribution. So to give you some idea of the change in terms of what's been occurring since the 2021-2022 financial year, the Makaroa FINCOs have increased by something like 71%. And look, all of the submitters that have submitted on your financial contributions all appreciate and accept that there needs to be small changes to the contributions based on inflation and other considerations, which is normal practice in terms of dealing with financial contributions over time. But the level of increase, and over time that level of increase, has been significant. So the council, I think, just reiterating on what was said by the previous speaker, needs to appreciate that the development and building sector is still under significant financial strain due to material costs, the general downturn in the housing and development market, and other considerations such as the cost of borrowing that everybody is facing in order to get the funding to actually do development. So for Makaroa, the increases, as I've said, are significant, which in the current market really is not a sustainable level of FINCOs, and Mr. De Jong will talk further about that when I've finished. The change, or the rapid change and increase in FINCOs, was actually experienced a number of years ago, back in Philip Martelli's day when he was here, and the council really looked at the infrastructure and reviewed that infrastructure quite heavily to see if there was anything that could be reduced or taken out to try and alleviate the levels of infrastructure to minimise the increase in costs to the development. So that's the current issue. In terms of my view on what's likely to occur, costs will be passed on to the home buyer, making housing costs more expensive. Planned developments would be postponed or re-evaluated or cancelled, and less affordable typologies of houses are likely to be built. So it's far easier to absorb these sorts of costs when you've got a higher value product, bigger site, views, etc. So it's going to affect, in the main, the much more affordable housing than perhaps other housing types. So the other likely outcome is a risk to council in terms of the further FINCOs removing any current tight margin that's here at the moment, and the reduction, the collection, if you like, in terms of what's likely to come into you to repay your debt that you've already got for infrastructure. There are, in my view, some obvious changes to the structure plans that could occur, including the removal of a number of the stormwater ponds, and I've detailed that in the McLaughlin Drive submissions. Some of those ponds shouldn't be FINCO funded because they're not servicing anything other than effectively what is one developer, and those are ponds 5 and 6 in the Te Puke structure plan in particular. And there's also the pond at Proll Road, which is in Mr. Goldstone's site, which I understand is now only to be used to service the Goldstone block. So those are my thoughts in terms of what's likely to occur. Now I'd like to sort of offer you some potential solutions. And there's really 6 possible sort of outcomes, or 7 if you do what you're proposing to do. One of the alternatives is that until there's an upturn in the property market, that any of these cost increases in terms of FINCOs are restricted to the costs of inflation only. And there should be also some value engineering applied to some of the aspects that are in the structure plans. Appreciating there's some things you can't change and you can't do anything with. Wastewater is probably one of those, but there are other things such as stormwater, roading and reserve infrastructure under the structure plans that you could review further and try and take out any further unnecessary infrastructure costs to keep these FINCO increases to a minimum. The second option that you could look at is a delay to the increase in the FINCOs for a period of, say, 12 months. And what that would do was that would allow a window effectively of developers to come in and take advantage of the current level of FINCO. the benefit of that is it helps you as well with your cash flow. So it's fair to the developer and also gets cash flow going in terms of receiving FINCOs from your end. Another option is to look to alternative funding options, and you've probably heard some of these things before around targeted rates, to try and more fairly apportion the costs over the life of the infrastructure, and that's really a fairer outcome in terms of intergenerational equity. Other funding options might be, and again, I'm not sure whether you've explored this or not, but talking to the central government about things like GST revenue from new housing and whether that's returned to council. One other thing which is in the pipeline too, which I think is important and is a potential solution, is this: if the water's done well, proposals proceed, and wastewater, stormwater and water supply are collectively managed by a future CCO, then one outcome could be that local government funding agency is likely to provide you with more financing to support these water CCOs, and that could assist higher growth councils such as Western Bay and Taronga City with additional financing and funding for 3 waters. Finally, the other option is the government's new work program, which has identified replacing development contributions and FINCOs with these new development levies, and effectively a mix of development levies and targeted rates. So that would also involve some kind of pause, effectively awaiting for those. I understand they're not due to come out until sort of 2026, 2027, but that would again encourage developers to act and finish stages and pay financial contributions based on the levels that they're currently facing rather than these new ones, and assist you with receiving funding in advance of when you're likely to receive it if you proceed as you've notified the increases. TCC did that a couple of years ago in terms of gave that kind of window, and I think it worked reasonably well. A number of developers took advantage of that and paid up their money earlier, and council received it ahead of time. So I'd now just like to hand over to Mr. De Jong, who may want to have just a brief discussion with you on the Omokoro specific financial contributions.
Thanks, Aaron. I think I sat in front of you a couple of years ago, so good to be back. Or not so. I was having a little bit of a look at the increases we've had over the last 5 years, and it's actually quite staggering out at Omokoro. So we've got a sort of 150 lot development that we've just titled the first stage. And since 2021, those FINCOs were $51,000. We've then seen an increase of 14, then 18, then 15, and now the proposed 11 to get to a total of, as Aaron said, 71% increase, which makes it really difficult from our perspective for our development there, but also looking at new developments with the uncertainty around these increases because they are so large. We, when typically put together a feasibility to purchase a piece of land, will always include a nominal increase in the FINCOs or development contributions, depending on where it is, to allow for that increase. But these are significant, and we operate right around the country. I guess my region that I look after is Bay of Plenty, so I sort of have a good idea of how that compares to around the region. And so I wrote a few of those down today just to give you a bit of an indication. So Bethlehem, Pies Pa, 14,500 and 8K per lot, respectively. Rotorua, 25,000, Matamata, 14, Taupo, 18, Waihi, 13, so that's Waihi town. And compare that to Waihi Beach, which is in obviously the Western Bay district, 64K per lot, which, as Aaron said, I guess one of the remedies or the issues is that value for money and making sure we're getting that value for money. It's quite difficult to see when you compare Waihi Beach with Waihi, where we're operating. We have a 70 lot development in Waihi at 13K per lot versus Waihi Beach at 64K. Yeah, quite hard to, I guess, one, understand that value for money, but also yeah, giving us the confidence to be able to purchase that next piece of land to understand what the FINCOs in the future are going to be, because sometimes it's, as you know, a number of years away from purchasing the piece of land till houses are built. Thank you.
Thank you. We'd be happy to answer. We'd be happy to answer any questions.
Right, thank you. First up, councillor Thwaites.
Thanks, Aaron. Aaron, if growth's not going to pay for growth 100%, do you have a figure how much growth should contribute? Because there's a coin and you're on one side and the other side is ratepayers. So ratepayers contact me daily and tell me about the cost of their rates. They sit in traffic now for an hour, and when it used to take 12 to 15 minutes, they're not very friendly towards developers, really. So if I'm going to say, well, I'm actually going to put your rates up to subsidise these guys, do you think that's going to go down well?
I think that's always been a tension. It doesn't matter whether the development contributions are 40,000 or 100,000. There's always a tension between what's paid for by development. In other words, development pays for growth, or whether there's some kind of rates contribution. My view on this thing is that there's always benefits. So, for example, if you look at Omokoroa, there's recreation and reserve and other infrastructure which will benefit everybody. I think it's a tension that's not easy to overcome, but I think what you do need to be aware of is there is a line which, if you cross, development will simply stop. And if there's no margin, and if you drive down Omokoroa Road at the moment, you'll see there's a whole lot of signs up, sections for sale for $400,000. Now, if you've got a land cost input per site of 150, development costs of 150, and 100 for the council financial contribution, no developer's going to go and develop because they're simply not going to make any margin. I mean, at the end of the day, they're there to make money. So that's a tension that council's always had, and particularly in terms of urban growth areas. I mean, I've tried to give you some options in terms of other things. I mean, you are stepping up and actually providing at a sub-regional level for a whole lot of the growth. So maybe there's also a need for the likes of the regional council and others to start contributing, particularly in terms of things like stormwater solutions.
Because we've seen the other side of the coin, and we've had that big list of discount, what I call low FINCO or development fees around the country. But the Hamiltons and the Tauranga now have spent their maximum credit allowance, and now their ratepayers are now going to face huge rate increases because they can't borrow anymore. So they've been fooling themselves for 20 years. Look at the way Hamilton got developed.
Yeah.
My in-laws come from over there. That was so cheap over there. I just couldn't believe they could do it. And now they've hit the road. They've been running deficits for years, and now it's coming home to roost. That rates are going to go through the roof through subsidising that development and not collecting the development.
Yeah, I think in terms of your debt levels, I think CCOs may help in the future in terms of water infrastructure in particular, because you may be able to look at more of a targeted rate for some of these areas, for some of these urban growth areas. It's not the perfect solution either, because it all helps to increase the cost, as Peter Cooney would say to you if he was here, goes on the key that goes in the door. But it is a solution, and there's a whole lot of things in that toolbox that you'd need to look at. But it's not just loading up that FINCO. At some point, development will simply stop, and then you guys have already invested significantly in terms of infrastructure, particularly at Omokoroa and Te Puke, and I wouldn't like to see that stop.
Thank you for that. Councillor Murray Benge.
My partner came back from Auckland this morning at a really smooth trip until he hit Loop Road, and then it was bumper to bumper, and the Te Puna roundabout was absolutely jammed packed. And to say that he was not impressed is underestimate. But so I can't blame any developer for the cost on the stupidity on the roads that we're enduring at the moment. And we cannot do anything unless any developer is prepared to take the risk to actually do a development. Our hands are tied and we can't do anything. So you've given us a list of issues that you think could help. And I'd like to know from you, Mr. John, how would this help you when you look at the cost you're paying at Waihi, and they don't seem to be going bung, but at Waihi Beach, we're spending a fortune. How does that make it affordable for any young person who wants to own a home? My first question.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really difficult. As Aaron said, those costs just get passed on to the homeowner, and to have that disparity between the regions will make us, I guess, yeah, we're definitely looking at other areas of the country to develop rather than the likes of Omokoroa to Puki, where those FINCOs are so high, because it's unsustainable.
So tell me, with the Waihi, does that mean you can, with the cost of their infrastructure, can you then afford to build affordable houses?
Yes, we can. Or that's 50K, that difference that goes to the homeowner. And with the, I guess, the land prices there, yes, to support that, and Waihi versus Waihi Beach being a beach town versus a local town.
Mr. John, Classic have developed affordable housing out at Omokoroa, and they seem to have stopped. I think they had the advantage from our council at that time. Can you tell us, is that the sort of issue you're looking for, the support?
I think you're probably referring to Kaimai Views, which was a very successful project between with us and council. If there were opportunities like that in the future, yeah, that would be great. But I guess we're in the position now where we have land on Prole Road consented. We're stuck with the FINCOs that are proposed here today, but it means that the housing stock that we release is going to be significantly higher than what is in Kaimai Views. Where would you rather buy a house, Kaimai Views or what we've got now? It's very difficult to sell when that price is 50K different just from the FINCOs.
Thank you. Moving on, Mayor Denia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my question was around your suggestion for reducing FINCOs, and you did give us some examples, but they're sort of quite high level. And I think Councillor Thwaites has discussed the likelihood, should we say, of general ratepayers wanting to subsidise developers. So what suggestions have you got for reducing FINCOs? And you talk about value engineering, for example. Some things I defer, and that's sort of financial engineering. That's one thing, but in terms of actual infrastructure that is perhaps not necessary, what do you suggest there? Have you got anything concrete rather than just hopefully get it cheaper, which is quite aspirational, possibly?
Well, for example, as I've given you some examples in terms of stormwater ponds, there's some stormwater ponds still sitting in the FINCOs. That my understanding is that they don't need to be there. One of them is a solely servicing one developer, and that developer should be picking up that cost. And the other one, council, I think, are working at the moment, which is Pond 4 at Te Puke, to get rid of that and remove it, because it involves a massive dam kind of structure. So I think the value engineering can go a long way to looking to reduce. And you know, I looked at, and I don't want to use Tauranga City as an example because they don't do it perfectly, but I look at Te Akaroa Drive, for example, which is still a 2-lane road. That was always going to be a 4-lane gold-plated highway. It's still operating as a 2-lane road. So some of these projects need to be perhaps broken down into further stages, and so maybe council needs to say, well, in terms of this particular road, does it need to be at the standard, or do we stage the development of it? Because bringing all of that funding forward is expensive.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Thank you.
All right, we've got another question then, Councillor Murray Benj.
I'd just like to ask you about ring fencing and targeted rates. Can you explain as to how that would actually work, and would it mean it was more affordable?
It certainly is just another means of funding that infrastructure, but in my experience with targeted rates, and I've been involved with targeted rates both at the lakes and also at Fraser's development at Papamoa, those targeted rates more appropriately allocate the cost of infrastructure over the life of the infrastructure. So effectively, instead of the current landowner or house purchaser picking up the entire cost of that infrastructure up front, it's more appropriately allocated over a period of time. And it's almost an issue of more fairer intergenerational equity. It's still a cost, don't get me wrong, it's still a cost, and purchasers won't like it, but it is an alternative. It's a different way of allocating that in a fairer way over a longer period of time.
Does the development have to be in order to allow that to occur?
The Fraser's development was, I think, a couple of hundred lots, 200 and maybe 260 lots, something like that.
Okay, thank you. One more question, Councillor Daly.
Aaron, I'm interested in your suggestions about the Te Puke ponds, but in view of interaction with some other ratepayers, concerned about the Dunlop Road subdivision, but I won't go there right now. But the suggestion that you talked about receiving funding in advance of the full increases. I'm not quite sure exactly what you meant there. Did you say do a stepped approach? So you maybe have a two-stage approach where you charge less now, but the rest later, or is it just a straight discount?
No, I didn't suggest less now and more later. What I suggested was you effectively put everything on ice at the moment, give the developers, say for example, a year to come in and basically pay their FINCOs under the current level of FINCOs. So what that does is that if they pay now, they get it at a slightly cheaper rate. And then that's a benefit for you as well, because you collect that cash in advance of when you're likely to collect it, instead of putting an 11% increase on, which means you're going to collect it a lot later.
So even if it hasn't reached the threshold to collect the rate or to demand the FINCO, I should say, is that a change in process, or?
Well, certainly it would be a change in your policy.
Yeah. So when you did that, you probably wouldn't be ready for your Section 224 either.
There are developers out there that would bring, if there was a financial incentive for them to bring forward works and apply for 224s sooner, because they were going to get effectively a lower financial contribution. There are people that would do that.
Because you have to start paying rates once you've got your 224, don't you?
Yeah, you do, once you've got your 223, but the incentive is there's an additional 11%. And then, of course, they don't know what's going to happen at the end of next year and the following financial year. But certainly there's a pattern. And as I've said with Omokoroa, the rate of increase has just been astronomical. It's been 71% since the 2021 to 2022 financial year. So certainly developers will do the numbers, and if it's worthwhile, effectively forward funding that financial contribution to you, if you keep the current FINCO.
And just finally, you talk about looking at other regions for development. Yeah, I guess you must have commitments to land that you've already purchased, and you're just looking at putting it on ice and just going somewhere else and maybe hoping things will improve here, or offloading what you've already got?
Well, it's pretty common knowledge that a lot of developers in the Bay of Plenty are looking elsewhere, particularly the Waikato and other locations. For example, Mr. De Jong just mentioned a subdivision in Waihi. That's in Hauraki district. There's more Tauranga developers doing subdivisions and development in the likes of Matamata, because it's more affordable.
Can I just, one last question. Are you familiar with the Queenstown Lakes market? Because we sort of took our FINCO model using a lot of their methodology, I think. So are they up there as well?
Well, my understanding is that the housing market here is pretty depressed. There's not a lot selling, and I wouldn't say the same about Queenstown. I think Queenstown's probably the hottest market in the country. So it's quite a different scenario to have a high rate of financial contributions in a really hot market versus a high rate of financial contributions in a flat market with high costs.
Right, I think we've exhausted the questions, so I thank you for there. You've certainly given us some food for thought around how you think you could generate some interest and activation in the market. So councillors will obviously at a future point deliberate on the information you've given us and reach a decision.
Thank you, and I'll be happy to send you through those 6 points if you want them.
Yeah, that would be very good. Thank you. If you could do that.
Thank you.
Much appreciated. All right, so thank you, councillors and staff. That's the end of our hearing for today.